right. Thank you, Jason, and thanks to the board for the invitation to be here and share thoughts on the Clean Power Plan. And also, Jason, thanks for switching the order of the presentations. It's my plan to, when I get a question that I can't answer, to simply say that Al's going to cover that in his presentation. So. All right. All right, so we're talking about the Clean Power Plan. As you know or may not know, EPA Administrator Gina McCarthy signed the final plan on August 3rd. It hasn't been published in the Federal Register yet, but we expect that in the next few weeks or relatively soon here in October. And one of the things that I think is important to note is that the final Clean Power Plan that came out for 111D for the existing sources is quite a bit different than what we had looked at, or what many of you probably looked at in the proposed plan. So what's coming our way? There are three actions here. One of them is the final Clean Power Plan, like I said, existing electric generating units, also referred to as 111D, which is the reference in the Clean Air Act. And then the final rule for new power plants and modified or reconstructed. And then lastly, and very importantly, is the proposed federal plan. Now, when that comes out in the Federal Register, there will be a comment period, and we'll be looking at that pretty closely at that time. Right now, what we have is the pre-publication versions of these documents. So, what's different? I'm going to be talking about primarily 111D here for the existing sources, the Clean Power Plan. So what's different? What changed between the proposed and the final? Well, most notably is the state goal changed significantly for Wyoming. So much so that when I first saw the number, the target, I thought the baseline had changed because we had expected the target to actually go up because we thought we had made some pretty reasonable arguments to EPA as to what was achievable. So I was quite a bit astonished when I saw that, the new target, as were some of the other states as well. Now, how EPA went about calculating the state's targets changed. And instead of looking at some of the criteria associated with states specifically, in terms of what wind energy generation could be developed or how much natural gas that was available or was already in use in your state. They looked at it on a regional basis rather than a state-by-state basis, which that was a big driver in changing the targets. EPA did continue to look outside the fence line with the renewables. That was something that many states had commented on, which was problematic or a concern from a legal standpoint, and whether or not they had the ability to go outside the fence line when regulating electric generating units. Now, one really big change that we think has had a significant impact was there's no credit for renewable energy that was in place before 2013. Now, the significance of that, and this is in the proposed rule, the difference between the 19% that was identified in the proposed rule is in terms of our reduction. We were looking at it and saying, no, that's really 26% from the start point. Well, the difference was we were given 7% credit for existing wind, so that drove it down to a 19%. That's off the table now. Now, one of the big comments we made in our comments on the proposed rule was that we felt that the rule needed to address reliability and the remaining useful life of facilities. And the way EPA addressed that was they came out and said, that's a good idea, states when you submit your plan, you need to address reliability and remaining useful life. They didn't really address that in the final rule. Now, one of the things that they did do, which we think is beneficial, is that they changed the criteria for obtaining extensions. Before, the extension would be granted if you entered into a multi-state program or not. Here, they've changed that criteria such that they've lowered the bar for states to be able to get an extension to the timelines. And basically, in essence, you have to show reasonable progress, that you're not just ignoring the rule, you're actually doing some things to further obtaining a plan. Now, EPA has, they proposed right now a federal plan which can be used as a model for states if they choose to do that. And what EPA will be taking comment on is a plan that would be using a rate base, or a plan that would be using a mass basis for reducing your emissions. So what does that look like in real numbers? Just as a summary, in EPA's proposed rule, our rate base would have dropped from 2,331 pounds of CO2 per megawatt hour to 1,714. When we went through our analysis of their proposed rule and looked at what was really practically achievable, we calculated a number of 2215 for the reduction, and the EPA final rule was 1299. So you can see quite a bit of a change there. Now, on a mass base, that number is roughly 32 million tons of CO2 if we were to convert that to a mass base. If you do the math on that, and I don't know that we have an answer for this right now as to why this is, but if you look at it on a rate base, the difference or reduction is 44%. If you take the number that they have in the final rule on the mass base, it works out to a 37% reduction. No, I don't know that that answers the question of which is the best way to go, but it's just an observation that we've made. We haven't been able to really put our finger on as to why that is at this point. And one of the reasons is, and I failed to point that out at the beginning, is so EPA came out with the final rule. The final rule itself was over 1,500 pages. The federal plan that is going to be open for comment was another 750 pages roughly. And then you have all of the supporting technical documentation. So you're looking at several thousand pages of rule and documentation that we're working our way through, and that's why it's taken a while. And I always enjoy when I get a call from a reporter 30 minutes after the rule has been released asking, well, what do you think? Well, we haven't gotten through it yet, but we're working our way through trying to make sense of, you know, how they came up with the numbers, what are the requirements going to be, and so forth, and how do we move forward with this. Okay, these are going to be some of the key slides, I think. What this slide shows is on fat finger. On the top line, the gray line here, and you don't need to worry about the numbers so much. This top number here represents what Wyoming calculated we could achieve reasonably in reductions of CO2. This dashed line is what the proposed rule had as targets for Wyoming, and the blue line represents what the final rule requires. So you can see quite a difference there. One of the comments that EPA heard over and over, not only from Wyoming but from several states, was this concept of a short timeline and what was referred to as the cliff. So you would have to achieve, in this case, this 1899 in the proposed, 70% of the goal would have had to been achieved in the first 2 years. So EPA moved the first target date out by a couple of years, but they made the distance greater. So they gave us more time, but they made the target harder to achieve. And this 1731 here, this first target date, is 58% of the goal. Now, the way there are still interim numbers, instead of having an interim target every year, EPA actually ends up with 3 interim targets for states to achieve. And I don't have them listed up here, but what they'll do is they'll take the 3-year average from 2022 to 2024, and then the 3-year average of 2025 to 2027, and then the last 3 years. They'll take those 3-year increments. And in the first 3 years, we'll have to achieve an average of 1,662, which amounts to a 29% reduction of our total CO2 emissions currently, and a 65% reduction of the total target. The second increment is 1,492. And then the last increment is 1373. And then, of course, on December 31st, 2030, you will have to achieve the 1,299 pounds of CO2 per megawatt hour generated. And I would just point out on this slide, if you can see it on the bottom, this just shows what factors we used when we calculated what we thought was achievable. And then if we were to achieve that, that's 8% of what the final target is what we think is practically achievable. Okay, so I thought this would be interesting just to put up to show what the targets are for various states. These are the top 10 most impacted states by the final rule. So you'll see South Dakota has the greatest reduction target to achieve, 47%, followed by Montana, North Dakota, and then Wyoming. And I also point that Colorado is in the top 10, so 5 of the 6 Region 8 states are in the top 10 in terms of the reductions, having the most stringent reductions. Now, you also have to take a look at this in, I think, not just percentages, because that can be a little bit deceiving. You have to look at the absolute pounds reduction that you have to achieve. And so you can see, in that case, Montana is number 1. Our target is a 1,032 pounds per megawatt hour generated reduction. Fairly significant. The starting point for Wyoming in the proposed rule was 19%. So we went from a 19% in the proposed rule to a 44%. North Dakota went from an 11% change to a 44%. Montana, I think they were around 17% and went to 47%. South Dakota, they actually went down. They were in the 60% in the proposed and went down to about a 40%, 47%. So anyway, some significant changes. So we saw significant changes from the proposed to the final that we hadn't anticipated. Now, I'll share with you just for informational purpose, this is the bottom of the list. So you can see Connecticut has the least amount of lift at a 7% reduction, 60 pounds per megawatt hour reduction. Anyway, so you can take a look at that. There are 3 states that are not part of this rule. Vermont, because they don't have any CO2 emitting facilities within their borders, so they're not part of the rule. Alaska and Hawaii were also not part of the final rule because of the methodology that EPA used. They're not part of the East or the West interconnect. Oops, so they have taken them out of the final rule, and they'll come back and they'll visit those, at least Hawaii and Alaska, in separate rulemaking down the road. So as I mentioned, they used a different methodology to calculate state goals and targets. And this is the part of that methodology. You have the Eastern Interconnect, the West, and then Texas. And Texas always thinks they're their own country anyway. So anyway, so the methodology, and we'll talk about this a little bit, creates some concerns in terms of how they calculate the goals. But rather than looking at it on a state-by-state basis, they looked in these different regions and they did the calculation how much wind energy by region, natural gas versus coal-fired ratio per region or by region. And that skews the data for a state like Wyoming. All right, so this one's a little bit busier graph, but we have the same lineup here as what we had originally projected. Here's the proposed, here's the final plan. We put this orange line on here to show you, had EPA used their calculations for the western region, which we're part of the western region, our target would have been, and I don't think you can see that, but 364 pounds per megawatt hour generated. And they thought that was not realistic. And so they said, well, we'll be conservative and we'll give them the eastern grid, which is the blue line, is the eastern grid, and they just applied that across the country. So everybody uses the calculation that came out of the eastern grid. Now, one of the flaws in the methodology here in using the western region, by 2027, you see that where it starts to flatten out, that assumed that Wyoming would have 0 coal-fired power plants. It also assumed in the Texas calculation that in 2026 they had 0 coal-fired power plants. And you can see on the bottom here, we laid out some of the assumptions that were used. So in the western region, 2.1% heat rate, which we agree with. That was in our comments. That was what we felt was reasonably achievable. In the proposal, it was 6%. So they gave us the 2%. The starting point for coal, on average for the western region, is lower than what our actual starting point is. Our starting point is 2331. And then they also factored in oil and gas. We don't have any of the oil facilities in Wyoming. And then they looked at a ratio, and this is the one where it seems most of the sensitivity comes in. The ratio of coal-fired power plants and natural gas combined cycle. In the western region, it's 52 to 48. In Wyoming, it's 99 to 1. And that really skews the data. Now, again, they use the eastern region, but even that ratio is 64 to 36, and ours is 99 to 1. So that makes a big difference in terms of what your final target ends up being. Okay, so how do they do the math? Okay, so this is a very simplistic view of how they do the math. There's a lot behind the numbers, but very simply, they established their performance rates for coal and for natural gas, and those numbers are 1,305 pounds for coal and 771 for natural gas. So it's a very simple equation. You multiply your percentage of coal-fired generation times 1,305, and then you multiply your natural gas generation by 771. You add the two together, and for us, you get 1,299. And then you can do your conversion to the mass. But that's a very simplistic way of taking a look at how they calculated each state's goal. And they did that for every state. So if you were 100% coal, you would have a 1,305 target. Okay, so what the final plan has from a schedule standpoint is, as I mentioned, you've got the three interim targets, and those are 3-year averages. I won't go into those anymore since I've already covered that. Oops. Okay. But what I did want to point out is once you get to that final goal timeline in 2030, so December 31, 2030, that's when you need to meet that target value. Every 2 years after that, you'll have to do a demonstration to show that you're still achieving that target. So it's not like once you've achieved it, you're done. There's a 2-year cycle where you have to make a demonstration where you actually are maintaining that target. All right, so where are our facilities? The red on the map will show you where each of the facilities are. We have 10 facilities and 20 units in the state that are part of the calculation that went into factoring the state target. If you break that down, we have 3 major utilities, Basin Electric, Black Hills, and Pacific Core. This just is interesting from the standpoint of you can see what the percentage, the total percentage statewide of megawatt hours generated and CO2 emissions in the state by each of the facilities. And then if you wanted to break it down by unit, this just shows those numbers by unit. And these slides will be available, so I'm not going to go into the detail here. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about wind, because when you go back to, you just back up here. So when you look at this slide, here's what we think we can achieve, all right? So we're at 2230. So the difference between the 2233 and the 1299, we have to look outside of our borders to figure out how we're going to achieve that reduction. Because we've done our analysis and we believe this is what we can achieve within our borders. That's with renewables, everything. So you'd be looking at an alternative solution, either through, well, the ERCs and the RECs, and Al will get into that a little bit more in detail. So the renewable energy credits or emission reduction credits, depending on which method you use. So obviously renewables plays a big part in all of this. So here is a map that shows everything that's not white, everything that's colored here, except for the coal mines, is class 4 through 7 wind. That's considered the economic wind available in Wyoming. Now you start peeling off, and this is what EPA said was available when they did their calculations, and it worked out to be 110 square kilometers of available wind. Now, let's start peeling off what's not available. So you got national parks and wilderness areas. Then we'll take out the core sage grouse area. Then we'll take out other sensitive areas from a wildlife standpoint, either migration corridors or other. And what you're left with is this dark brown. That is what is really available in Wyoming for wind energy development on an economic basis and without any of the other environmental constraints. And that worked out to about 18,000 square kilometers, so about less than 18% of what EPA had predicted was available for wind energy. And I raised that point just to emphasize, if those assumptions were made within the other states that have these same types of constraints, they may have I think they have overestimated the capacity of wind energy development or renewables in their calculations. Now, The other factor in all of this is transmission. In order, if you build this, you have to have new transmission in areas where the wind energy development is occurring. And as we've pointed out, if you look at the wind energy or the transmission projects to date that we've been working on here in Wyoming, we have a number of projects. Gateway West was the closest. That is in its 9th year of going through the EIS process with the BLM. These projects take a long time. Now you overlay that with the time frames associated with the targets that we need to achieve, and then we start to see some concern. All right, so in just wrapping up, some of the critical timelines here. We're still, like I said, working through the documents and so forth, but at some point we'll be reaching out. We've already started to reach out to the utilities to start getting their perspective and how they're viewing the rule, how far they think they can go in terms of compliance. We've been having discussions with other states, other stakeholders, and so forth. We will, at some point, be having public meetings as well along the area primarily where these coal-fired power plants exist. So the first milestone that's set out in the final rule is September 6, 2016. And we either have to submit a plan to EPA or we have to request an extension. And as I mentioned, the bar EPA intentionally made that bar not too high for states to be able to get that extension, but they have to show that they're making some reasonable progress. The next important date is a year later, where you either have to submit your plan or give a progress report on your extension. And then in 2018, the final plan is due. Now, in any one of these steps, if you choose not to play ball, you choose not to submit, you get a federal plan. As I mentioned earlier, that's what's out. That is what will be out for a 90-day public comment period. And whatever comes out of that process will be what you would be accepting if you choose not to do a state plan. Okay. All right. So in developing a state plan, the three components to get the extension, I should say, we have to identify what approach we're looking at. Are we looking at a multi-state? Are we looking at a mass base? Are we looking at a rate base? All of those things. You don't have to pick one, but you have to show that you're actually exploring that and investigating that in a serious manner. Show what progress you've made to date. You'll need to explain why you need the additional time. And then the third hurdle to getting the extension is engagement with the public. And the way they characterize it is not just engagement with the public, but engagement with those vulnerable communities, those communities that would be in closest proximity to an electric generating unit. So that's essentially the bar that EPA has set for obtaining an extension. Okay, and then as I mentioned, you would have to provide updates to your progress in 2017, and then lastly, the federal plan. They should come out with the proposed federal plan in the Federal Register this month. That's what we expect anyway, and there will be a 90-day comment period, and they're looking at either mass or rate base. They seem to be leaning more towards the mass base, at least that's the way we've been reading the conversations to date. And again, if we don't submit a plan, we get a FIP, or it's not a FIP, it's a federal plan. So we think that going forward and trying to evaluate the final plan, seeing what we can reasonably do to move forward is a much better option than taking on the federal plan. It keeps the state in control of that process. With that, I'll turn any questions over to Al.